vintage radio item with little known facts or lore. The Delco Appliance Corporation, Rochester, New York. Their first Delco-branded radios. An unusual story. I have been fascinated by the 32-volt DC light plant systems developed in the first quarter of the 20th century for rural areas and began over 25 years ago to collect home broadcast receivers designed to be powered by those systems in the 1930s. This advertisement in the American Agriculturalist for August 1931 may be one of the first announcements of a Delco-branded radio for such service. But first, a little background. Delco began when Charles Kettering and Edward Deeds formed the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, Delco, in 1909 to manufacture ignition sets for Cadillac. In 1912, Kettering earned acclaim for his first electric engine starter on this beautiful Cadillac. In 1913, Kettering first set out to provide for his mother, who lived on the farm, the convenience of electric power. He set up a gas engine and belt-driven generator that charged a set of batteries and wired the home to run on 32 volts DC. However, the system was not fully automatic. When the engine quit running and the batteries ran down, the mother simply reverted back to using kerosene lamps she was accustomed to. It was then that Kettering decided that a dependable and affordable means of furnishing electricity to the farm needed to be developed. In 1916, a new company called the Domestic Engineering Company was formed for the purpose of manufacturing and selling Kettering's light plant system. Sales that year were $2.5 million, and the company name was changed to the Delco-Light Company. In that same year, Delco was sold to United Motors for $9 million. 2 years later, in 1918, General Motors acquired United Motors and the Delco brand. The brand, as applied to electrical and electronic devices, survived as a subsidiary of various corporate mergers until 2004. There were other farm lighting systems on the market, but by 1920 Delco dominated all others. Kettering's 1913 system consisted of a separate gasoline engine and dynamo. There were problems with this scheme. One was safety. These engines were relatively high compression, requiring gasoline for fuel. Insurance underwriters would not allow residential building storage of more than 1 gallon of gasoline. There was no such prohibition on the use of kerosene, so a very low compression engine running on kerosene was developed that had a dynamo integrated into the engine housing. It has a scheme to crank the engine using the dynamo as a starter. During the Great War, about 5,000 systems were used by the military, with about 1,000 of them being used in hospitals and even to power X-ray machines. As mentioned 2 slides back, General Motors acquired the Delco business from United Motors in 1918. GM was highly skilled at developing marketing campaigns and a distribution network for their automobiles, and this 1922 map shows the outstanding successes Delco was achieving. Delco-Light sales staff received this remarkable 100-plus page loose-leaf notebook named the Delco-Light Story to use in their client sales pitches. In it is this map where each dot represents 10 light plants. Delco's home state of Ohio claims 12,000 satisfied users. At one time, there were said to be over 400,000 Delco light plants in service here and abroad. The notebook is filled with numerous high-quality illustrations with captions such as these. Delco-Light furnishes bright, clean, safe, and convenient electric light to any part of the home or outbuildings. And Delco-Light also supplies power for operating electrical appliances wherever they may be needed. The notebook is full of illustrations extolling the virtues of Delco-Light. There are a number of illustrations playing on the dangers of using old flame lamps and lanterns. On the same theme, we see ways the Delco-Light appliances can make for happy children. A Delco motor can now power a churn for making butter. A Delco well pump can now provide running water for the house and barn. Junior can now spend more evening hours in study. Mother is saved so many drudgeries if she has Delco-Light-powered appliances such as this electric vacuum, or a wringer washing machine, electric iron, etc. There are even on offer electric fans and bread toasters. This add-on business was great for Delco. It would be only natural that Delco would eventually want to add their own radio entertainment and information delivery solution to the lives of the Delco-Light system customers. How did they break into that market? Historian, the late Alan Douglas, reminds us that General Motors for some decades operated as a highly vertically integrated business, seeking to establish or purchase manufacturing capabilities for everything from small parts to complete automobiles and more, and everything in between. The strategy would be challenged by the federal government in the late 1920s in attempts to break up giant trusts that were accused of operating huge monopolies, limiting competition. The Dayfan Company of Dayton, Ohio, began making radio parts by 1921 and was building complete outfits by late 1924. Charles Kettering, who was by then a vice president of General Motors, invested substantial capital in the company, and for the next 4 or 5 years, the Dayfan Company may have produced upwards of 500,000 radios. But despite the volume production, the company was said to suffer $200,000 annual deficits. In October 1929, General Motors bought Dayfan, having a 51% interest, with RCA, GE, and Westinghouse controlling the remaining 49%. The reorganized company was renamed the General Motors Radio Corporation. This was a way for the new company to maintain RCA-controlled patent licenses assigned to Dayfan. The company, still operating in Dayton, would produce some interesting radios. But this financial arrangement between GM and RCA, which was a tightly held secret for some time, came under the eye of investigators and resulted in antitrust suits being filed in May 1930, and as part of a settlement, RCA and GM liquidated the General Motors Radio Corporation about November of 1931. Note the chassis on this 1931 General Motors Radio Corporation model named the Little General. The builder plate says GM, Dayton, Ohio. Delco's apparently first radio advertisement in August 1931 features what appears to be a very much the same chassis, but not identical. Chassis stampings have holes in different locations, and the end plate for the tuning capacitor is obviously different. The 3 tubes of the RF amplifier in the Little General are covered by a sheet metal divider type shield. The Delco uses 3 round tin can type tube shields. This Delco radio cabinet is hot branded as a product of Union Chest and Cabinet Corporation, Rochester, New York. Conclusion: these first Delco radios were not simply a rebranded GM Dayton product. Lore has it that by as early as 1935, Delco was subcontracting their radios to the likes of Wells Gardner, Crosley, Stewart Warner, U.S. Radio and Television, but prior to 1935, I do not have direct evidence that there was a radio chassis manufacturing line at the Delco facilities in Rochester. After having acquired a 600-watt rated Delco-Light 32-volt motor generator outfit purchased while running at the Denton, North Carolina annual 4th of July Threshers Reunion, I let it be known that I wanted to acquire a Delco branded 32-volt radio. They do turn up fairly regularly, but my research revealed that the ones that do show up date from 1935 onward. The earliest advertisement date from August 1931 as shown on slide number 2. This advertisement is undated but shows the exact same cabinet. Thanks to the sharp eye of Jeff Bourne, this Delco compact was spotted at one of those wonderful Michigan Antique Radio Club meets that used to be held in Lansing, Michigan. The front had a lot of finish simply flaking off, making it impossible to salvage, but the cabinet appeared structurally sound. The insides, however, were another matter entirely. Apparent mouse urine had eaten away up to half of the chassis steel thickness, making it necessary to resort to using auto body glazing putty to level the surface. The wires to the filter choke and capacitor filter block were too brittle to risk removing. I was able to drill out the rivets securing these parts and jack them up about 1/4 of an inch to work under them. The tuning capacitor and RF coil assembly had to come off, but there was no damage done to this wiring. The tube shields were not presentable, so were scraped and sanded with some liquid wrench solvent to present a level surface. Then multiple coats of so-called cold galvanized zinc-filled spray paint filled the minor pitting remaining. The resultant finish was rubbed with rotten stone to dull the finish. The output transformer mounted on the loudspeaker frame was missing. After finding a fuzzy picture on eBay, I made a 3D model in SolidWorks to advertise for a replacement. Unfortunately, there were none to be found by this method. Almost 2 years later, I stumbled across an intact transformer and loudspeaker assembly under a flea market table at the AWA conference. Price $10. A bargain that made my day. The top tuner shield looked awful, and I thought maybe I should just go ahead and sand the surface. But I always try to default to the least aggressive cleaning method first. I used waterless hand cleaner and a wood popsicle stick to rub the crud and frequently wipe off the excess with a soft cloth. It is a slow process, but removed more than 80% of the mess, leaving a reasonably acceptable surface. After any such cleaning, I always protect the surface from additional deterioration by using a clear satin, quick-dry, solvent-based acrylic spray coating. I decided not to overpaint the rest of the chassis since the original plating was in reasonably good condition. In order to keep my painting of the chassis from contrasting and distracting the viewer from appreciating the original design, I used a technique of faux paint to add the appearance of slight rust and oxidation similar to what remains on the original surfaces. In this technique, you apply an acrylic flat paint to a scrap surface, then daub a clean, dry bit of terry cloth into the paint to pick up a random trace of the paint that you then transfer to your newly painted surfaces using the same daubing action. The dynamic range of this image is not good enough to convey the effect all that well, but maybe it gives you some idea of what can be done. The circuit is a simple 3-stage tuned radio frequency receiver coupled to a detector and finally to a pair of Type 38 pentodes connected in parallel. The first generation of these radios used this version of the Type 36 and 38 tubes. They have the Delco logo on an embossed paper label and a Delco logo and type number molded into the base. The construction details are clear hallmarks of tubes made by Sylvania and are very rare in tube collections today. My skills at refinishing cabinets has never been all that good. One simple setup I use to enable spraying on horizontal surfaces is this scrap wood scheme of 2x2s, 2x4s, and plywood that clamps to the cabinet base or scrap wood panels clamped inside the case. A steel pipe allows the cabinet to rotate to another side quickly. Removing 4 screws enables folding of the stand so it does not take up too much space in my storage shed. The underside of this chassis is virtually free of signs of insect damage and aging. It appears that the mice were not curious enough to enter through the empty tube socket hole, obviously present for a soon-to-come 110-volt AC version of this radio. Time for many people to ask, does it work? The answer is probably not, and even if it does work, it won't for long. It was never designed to work for decades. I have 2 chassis that are wired with exactly the same components, so I think that there is every reason to think that these are original parts. Research indicates that there may be only 3 of these models left in any condition, and it is probably the best surviving example. This one, except for refinishing the surfaces, remains an accurate historical artifact, showing us the very first and uncommon product of a major brand of radios, so it is best left silent. What makes these sets really uncommon is the fact that it proclaims no A battery, just plug it into the light socket, the 32-volt DC light socket, that is. The radio still required 3 large dry cell B batteries like this Eveready No. 486 to provide a nominal 67.5 volts and 135 volts. These best-in-class Eveready layer-built batteries would provide 6 to 12 months service at an advertised price of $12.75 in 1931. That translates to about $218 in 2021 for up to a year of radio listening. But this likely was not a particularly well thought out solution, and they soon had a better, though expensive, solution. The Delco Appliance Company plant in Rochester, New York, was said to be the largest manufacturer of small motors at that time. It was therefore natural for them to think that they could design a whisper-quiet dynomotor that would run off 32 volts DC and provide a nominal 70 and 140 volts DC to replace the large B batteries. Under the motor are inductors and various small-value capacitors and large-value dry electrolytic capacitors to do an excellent job of preventing RF noise. The dome cabinet top has slots at the bottom of each end to provide ventilation. I have not seen an advertised price for this product, but presume that it was relatively expensive. There is only one other American-made home broadcast receiver that I am aware of, made in any quantity at all, containing a diminutive dynomotor. That is the circa 1934 Gruno Model 620 or 621 radio with a 6 HB chassis. I would love to have a good example of this set in my collection. Dayfan exhibited a radio in 1927 with a huge dynomotor suspended from spring hangers in the lower part of a radio table, but there is no indication that the outfit was ever sold in any quantity at all. While searching for the missing audio output transformer, I set a general Delco search on eBay, and about 2 years later, this set appears on offer. Ain't she a beauty? But it is the consulate version of the RA3 and appears complete. It bears the designation model RB3. I had to have it. As it turns out, I was to be the only bidder, and it was a pickup-only deal located near Utica, New York. Bruce Rollison was kind enough to get the radio and store it until the AWA conference held every year in Henrietta, New York. I was excited to get it, but was certainly uncertain as to whether it could ever be made presentable and not appear to be an amateur's effort. In 2021, another RB3 has been identified, and although still requiring significant conservation efforts, still appears to be in much better structural condition. The face of the cabinet was a real mess. Much of the veneer, although still present, had delaminated from the typical lumber core plywood commonly used at that time. As you may be able to see, pieces of the core wood fell out and were lost around the grill area. With my skill set and tools, solving this problem was an extreme challenge. I decided to reglue the veneer at the top of the panel. Since the veneer at the grill area was still present and free of dry rot, I cut it free and set it aside. I used cabinet-grade birch plywood to replace the grill area and inlay it into the panel to be flush with the top surface of the old lumber core. The old veneer was then glued on top. That was the easy part. I had to route a new OG profile on my replacement birch plywood core. Dremel used to make a router base attachment for their famous moto tool and offered a set of miniature router bits. I had purchased both years ago and very rarely ever had cause to use them. There was not the router profile I needed, but it was possible to cut part of the profile with one bit and then finish with the other. This proved to be an extremely difficult task for me since I had no edges to guide my cutting. I thought I had only one real chance to get it done well enough. The resulting work did produce a profile good enough to survive critical examination. There was no chance to salvage the top veneer. Cracked and bulging lumber core, dry rot along the veneer edges, and missing pieces. No choice but to replace. Unfortunately, modern veneers seldom have as tight a grain structure as wood used 90 years ago. I was not successful in separating the top from the cabinet body to simply re-glue the crack. So the crack in the core lumber was carefully filled. There is a bulge in the middle of the core lumber, and it was partially leveled by sanding. Modern slow-set veneer glue was applied, and the veneer sheet laid in place and rolled to purge bubbles. A thin and dense rubber sheet was placed over the veneer. I used just about every bar clamp I owned to apply pressure during glue cure. It worked. The bulge in the core lumber can only be seen if you lay a straight edge across the top surface. Despite the condition of these wood cabinets, the grill cloth on both cabinets were salvageable. They had been glued in place using hide glue that did not soak the cloth too much in many areas. It was possible to shave the cloth free of the panels. In a few places, a few drops of water needed to be applied and left for 20 minutes or so for the glue to soften enough for separation. Old loose grill cloth is very difficult to handle and clean without considerable damage or outright destruction. I have recently discovered a simple and effective way to protect cloth such as this during cleaning. Just about any hobby shop has sheets of so-called plastic canvas as used in stitchery arts. Sheets are available up to 13.5 inches by 22 inches. You take 2 sheets and stitch a hinge along one edge of the sheets. Lay in the cloth and close the other edges with thread to form a pouch. Then loosely stitch the edge of the grill cloth through the plastic canvas using a small needle and thread to prevent the cloth from shifting within the pouch. You can now lay the pouch horizontally into a shallow bowl of pleasantly warm water and mild dish detergent. Gently lift the pouch up and down through the water to facilitate soil removal. Allow to soak for a while, then use a kitchen sprayer to gently flush the soil and old glue away. While still in the pouch, use a hairdryer on gentle heat to dry the cloth. I have had excellent results, but can tell you that I have done it only 3 times so far. As they say, your mileage may vary, but with cloth this soiled, what have you got to lose? The rusting of the chassis and shielding was not so severe on this consulate model, so a decision was made to avoid any painting to simulate the plating. I did not think it was possible to salvage the Delco logo decal applied to the top of the electrifier case, but after an unreasonable amount of effort, I was delighted to see most of the decal surviving. The stripping of the bent wood cover on the electrifier was very difficult. The shield over the detector tube was missing, and I had to make a replica. The top cap is a deep-drawn steel stamping, something I cannot do. My alternative was to use a metal spinning technique to fashion the cap. I have very little experience in such things, so I must have made 4 or 5 attempts before producing an acceptable part. Fortunately, the difference between the original and replica shield is not so obvious as it is shown here, since there is only one such shield per chassis. The radio does not have the original issue Delco branded balloon-style tubes as in the table model version shown here. There is a later mix of ST bulb RCA branded tubes and tubes with the Delco logo only ink stamp on the tube base. Manufacturer unknown. So what has been accomplished by this conservation and restoration project? I discovered an interesting backstory to the founding of this radio manufacturing enterprise. I discovered that these 2 radios were the very first products offered to the home broadcast receiver market by a company that sold at least hundreds of thousands of radios in the 1930s and into the 1940s. These radios have an almost unique solution for powering radios on farms and other rural locations equipped with 32-volt DC lighting systems. Years of researching indicate only 2 or 3 examples of each model survive in any salvageable condition. These 2 examples appear to be the only ones that have undergone any significant conservation work, making them suitable for exhibition or use as historical reference artifacts. And it proved to be a very interesting and difficult but gratifying project to test my particular skill set. Just because Delco was a big business does not mean that its history has been fully documented. I still have not found direct evidence that there was indeed a radio chassis production line at a Delco factory in Rochester, New York, from the start of the Delco brand name radio in 1931 on into 1934. I would certainly welcome documented clarification on this matter. For some years, later models of Delco-branded radios would have a metal chassis tag saying only United Motors and not having any city location markings. There is the presumption that these sets were built entirely by subcontractors.